So some of the other third parties that have existed rather successfully in Texas are things like the Grange and the populist movement. The Grange, you may remember from being really influencing of our 1876 Constitution, the farmers trying to input their agrarian interests into our new Constitution. Excuse me, the Dixiecrats, which we'll talk about here in just a second, as well as La Raza, which if you attended that, the Rosie Castro discussion or speech, you would have heard her talk about the influence of how they won several local elections in Texas. Libertarian Party obviously was very successful more on the national level with places like Ron Paul and Nader. And then in 2006, we actually had a lot of independent candidates run for governor. One that you'll see right over here is Kinky Friedman. He was an author and a musician who ended up having a fairly successful run for governor, although he ended up losing. He did gain a lot of traction, which was shocking, but he also was independently wealthy, and so funding his campaign was not as much of a challenge as it could be for other third-party candidates. Excuse me. So looking at our history as a one-party state, it really started after we entered back after the Civil War to the United States. The Democratic primary was really where the most competitive elections were held because we were strongly Democrat at the time. Often Republicans wouldn't even run candidates in the general election. We know the difference between the primary and the general election is that the primary selects candidates to run in the general election. Excuse me. But a lot of the times, Republicans didn't stand any chance in winning the actual general elections. They wouldn't bother wasting the money. What else is important to note is that just because it wasn't competitive in the general election doesn't mean it wasn't competitive in the primary elections. And I mean by that is that there was a lot of inter-party competition in the primary. Things like what you would have seen in 2016 with Hillary and Bernie. Okay. About 1940, 1950, we started seeing a split within the Democratic Party that resulted in what's called presidential republicanism, which kind of foreshadowed the split and the shift, the realignment that occurred in the 60s, the last political realignment. And this is because of the Shriver-Crap movement held by Governor Alan Shrivers. He felt as though the conservative Democrats should support the Republican candidate at the federal level, Eisenhower. They didn't believe that they felt that the Democrats had become too liberal. National Democratic Party had become too liberal. And so nationally they would support the Republican while they would support the Democrat at local elections. Okay, and so that was called presidential republicanism that started under the Shriver-Crap movement. We then had moved into the era of conservative Democrats, okay, and you might remember from the Shriver-Crap movement, local elections were more conservative Democrats. It was still stronghold of the Democratic Party, but it gave rise to conservative Democrats, or what's called blue dog Democrats. And that dominated during about 50s, 60s, and 70s. These are more conservative fiscally and racial Democrats, okay? So they were more conservative in terms of segregation and discrimination and in terms of the economic policy, more aligned with the modern-day Republican Party. And then the real big shift happened in 1980s with the growth of the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan, the support of Ronald Reagan and Bush. We know that Bush, H.W. Bush, the one who just passed away, was George Bush's father, and was very popular in the state of Texas as well. This is just a little composition to describe how the decline of the Democratic Party in the 80s and the rise of the Republican Party. So conservative Democrats or blue dog Democrats currently are really, they think there's two left, Henry Cuellar and Feliman Vela. It's very difficult to be a conservative Democrat in Texas, okay, because of what I described earlier, our partisanship and party polarization. Conservative Democrats are really very unsuccessful, and the same goes for liberal Republicans, or rhinos, Republican in name only, they tend not to be very successful. Okay? Yellow dog Democrats, on the other hand, are your liberal Democrats, very strongly Democratic. They would vote for any Democrat over any other candidate. And that's what essentially what I was just saying, is that we have lots of different factions within the contemporary Republican and Democratic Party. Things like the religious right, our economic conservatives, neoliberalism, democratic socialists, things like that. Okay, and I had mentioned this earlier, so I'm probably just going to swipe through these. Is that our urban areas in Texas or cities are very Democratic. They're much more blue than the rural areas, and rural areas tend to be much more solidly conservative, especially areas of oil in West Texas. But our African American domination is very, very strong in Texas as well, and they tend to be extremely Democratic. Okay, extremely Democratic. We have a lot of prominent mayors that were elected. African American mayors that were elected to cities. Mayor Sylvester Turner from Houston, Prairie View, former Mayor Ivy Taylor. All of these are very, very large cities with African American mayors. Okay, and that's the end of that. I have some little political ads if you want to watch those. But I hope that you guys found this helpful. Please give me some feedback as to things that we can improve on here, because we know moving forward we might have to do more of these online video lectures. So please let me know what you guys think, if there's anything I can do to improve them or the experience. And I will see you guys after the weekend.